Today is all about grids. So we did a webinar on Tuesday. In case you missed it, it was part one of the 2020-06 launch, and that was a general update. However, we have the Servoy NG Grids web package, which contains a couple of advanced feature-rich grid components, and there was a lot of work done on those and a lot of enhancements. So I think that it warrants its own webinar. I think there's enough new stuff here to show that you'd be interested in, that we could take up a whole 20, 30 minutes just to go over what's new. Moreover, these grid components are used by almost everyone that I see because it's a very common functionality. So I think this is applicable to everyone. That's why I selected it to do an update webinar about it. So I'm going to go through a bunch of sort of micro demos of the different enhancements that we've added, covering the two main components that we ship here, the data grid and the power grid. These demos are going to be really focused on what's new, like what's changed, and not necessarily an introduction to these components. So it assumes that you know a bit about what these components do. It doesn't mean that you wouldn't understand what's going on here, but it's kind of starting with just what's changed. So if you want to catch up on how to use these components, if you're new to Servoy or new to the NG client, there are prior webinars about this as well. Yeah, so I'm going to go through a list of little demos, and we can answer questions along the way or at the end. So please send those questions in as you think of them. Real quick, there's one potentially breaking change in these enhancements, and that was the on-sort event. We improved it to be able to handle when you click sort on multiple columns. So the on-sort event is when you are clicking on column headers and it's sorting the data in the grid, and you can, of course, shift-click to select more than one column to sort by. Now the sort of, that's always worked, but the sort event is when you want to capture that click and override it. The main use cases for this are when you are clicking on things that can't naturally be sorted in the database. So that would be valueless display values or calculations. Those won't sort, or at least won't sort the way you kind of want, the user would expect them. So you can intercept that and sort it on your own. And if you are using one of those sorts, it now sends in multiple columns, so you'll have to refactor that method. So you can see the old implementation just passes in the column that was clicked or the index of the column that was clicked and what the direction was, either ascending or descending. And now it's going to pass in an array of column indexes and array of directions for the sort. I can show you what that looks like quickly in the IDE. I have a demo solution running here with a grid up, and I can sort by, say, city, and if I shift-click, shift-click, then you can see I have my primary country and city is the secondary sort. This is calling that event, and if I look at the binding I have in the IDE, so we have our example grid here. I'm handling the on-sort event with a method. I wrote some code, but commented it out. And this would be, for example, if we're sorting on the employee ID, which is shown with a value list. You don't want it to sort on the ID. You want it to sort on the display value. That's one use case. Anyway, it's passing in, you can see, an array of numbers, an array of strings, which will be ascending or descending, which then you can manipulate. So suppose a user clicks on a natural column and a calculation, you kind of want to pick up that they clicked on that calculation and maybe ignore it or sort it differently, and then send it back into the found set to do the sort. So that's one kind of use case here. Anyway, if you're using this already, that's a bit of a breaking change. You'll have to go in and refactor that. So that's why I wanted to do that one first, because that's good to know. So we'll just go through these enhancements one by one. One thing we added was now support for a filter type of value list on the grid column headers. So I'll show what that looks like, and then I'll show how to set it up. Over in the grid we have here, I have this the city column here. I can choose to filter this, and now I have a type ahead here, which will use a value list for all the cities. So I created a value list for cities, and I can go ahead and do the type ahead for that and apply the filter. So that was added. If we look at the IDE for what was done there, again, if I go to my grid here and go to the city or ship city column, you can see that I've set the filter type to value list. So that's the property that was added. And then of course you have to supply a value list. So that's coming from cities, which is just getting all cities from the orders table, or sorry, from the customers table. So you can just use that as your filter type. So that's, again, that's a property on the column called filter type is set to value list, and you have to supply a value list. There is a similar enhancement for grid header filters because we also support a radio option. So that would be when you want to have an exclusive selection, ideally for Boolean type values, although it doesn't have to be Boolean, but if you think about if you have orders with a status and you want, status open or closed, but not both. But it can really apply to anything. It just shows the values in the value list as a discrete choice with the radios instead of something like a type ahead. So let me show what that looks like. So for the country column, I set up a filter type here, with a country's value list and with a radio option. So I can do, Argentina and apply, and it's only going to do Argentina or Austria, apply. So that's a new filter type. Let me clear that out. And then if I go into the IDE, I'll show what that looks like. So on the column here where I set up the ship country data provider, you can see that, again, we added another filter type here for radio. And if you select that and provide your value list, this is just countries coming from the customers table, but you got to provide a value list property as well. It'll show each value in the value list as a radio option. So it's pretty easy to set up. Again, I wouldn't show a whole list of countries like that with probably the type ahead works better, but if it's something, with one of those custom value lists where you just have a few values and you only want the user to be able to select one, that's the idea. Something which was requested, this is a small programming enhancement, but it adds to convenience when you're handling some of the click events. Those click events used to pass, and I guess this could potentially be a breaking change as well. Probably should have listed that as such. The events used to pass kind of like a record info object, but it wasn't. It was kind of just a simple object that had the record contents, but it wasn't really the class object of the class JS record. So now those events have been updated so that they pass in the actual JS record object, so you can handle it directly and do all the things that a record API can do. And so I'll sort of show what that looks like here. I think I've handled the double click event here. And so if I double click in my grid, I'm showing what that it was double clicked and what the total was. And if you look at the order ID as well. No, I didn't put the order ID, sorry. If you look at the event handler for this, you can see that JS record object is now passed in, and I've typed it to the orders table. And so now I can quickly get, anything off that record, a related, you know, a related value, a column value, some of the record API, doesn't matter. Something that's nice is grids now have a built-in aggregate for row counts, and all you have to do is tick one property to display that. So you may notice once I group here, let me group by country, that in my groups here, it's showing the record count for each of the groups. And so that's something that you previously could only do with a power grid with a cached result. And then the aggregates were done actually in the component, you know, with just the cached results. This is done server side. So what that means is that suppose that if in this group Argentina, rather than 16, I had 16,000, I don't need to send 16,000 records to the component for them to be aggregated. That's done automatically with the SQL aggregate server side. So it figures out the definition of the groups, and it does that for you. And you can see if I add a secondary group, the city, it does it however, you know, however deep you go. The way to set that up is pretty simple. You select your grid, and there's one property here called show group count. It's disabled by default, but if you tick it and set it to true, then your group counts will show up. So that's a pretty nice addition. Another area where the grid was enhanced was having to do with whether or not groups are expanded or collapsed, and getting programmatic access to that. But the first step in that was just making them persistent between data reloads. So the way it used to be is if you were to say, come in here and, I don't know, expand Austria and Graz, and then suppose we lost the data, we did a search, or here I'll filter on a different country and go to Argentina, right? And then if I were to clear the filter and come back, I'd have to go in and everything would be already just expanded. So I'd have to come in and go and reset up my grouping and which rows were expanded or collapsed. Now it will actually remember that between data loads. So no matter what, when I come back, this is persistent between data loads. That's just within a given session. Now we added a new event to capture when a group is expanded or collapsed. It's called on row group opened. And it passes in, it's sort of like the path to the group. So it passes in because you could have nested groups. So it passes in the group column indexes. So that's the columns that it's grouped by. And then it passes in the keys that it's grouped by, and then whether or not it's expanded or collapsed. So you could use that information for different things. For example, you may want to persist it and set it later, but there's a different way to do that. So I'll show how to handle this and what it looks like. You can see that under the events, I have a new event here on row group opened. And if I look at my handler for that, I'll get to this storing the expanded groups in a second, but I'm just going to uncomment this and save it. And if I come back here and collapse Graz, you can see that the column index is there. 3.2 is country city, Austria Graz, and Graz was collapsed. And then if I expand it again, you can see it's the same path to get there, but now the value is true because it was expanded. So you can really tell what's expanding and collapsing, and that comes in handy for different reasons. Now, I didn't really use the information in this method handler, but I did do the next thing, which was to persist the row group expansion state between client sessions. So I'll show what that looks like. First, I want to talk about how I got there. We added another API call to set or get the expanded groups. which is an object that preserves that state, which you can serialize to storage, either in a database or local web storage, whatever you feel. So it's ideal for doing that between sessions. Another thing you could do is you could use this in some sort of navigation, like if you had a back button or something and you went back to a form and you wanted to, reset some sort of grouping, you could persist it between navigation events. But in my example, I combine the first property here, the on row group opened event that we added, with this API to set and get, and I take it so that I can persist the row group expansion state between sessions. So I'll show what that looks like. And more generally, the topic of persisting the state. Well, I should show in the client before I get in the IDE. So looking in the client here, you can see that I have grouped by country, city. I've expanded Austria, and I've expanded Graz. So what I'm going to do is just close this. I'm going to come in and relaunch the NG client, so I get a new session and navigate to this form, and you can see that it groups it the way I had it, and it expands the groups that I had set. So it's fully persistent. So the way that I did that, again, is I handled that on row group opened. I didn't really use this information. That's why I had it commented out. I just wanted to show what was passed in. But I wrote another method here, store expanded groups. And you can see that down here. I just use that get set functionality. I get the expanded groups. And then I just write that to local web storage. Getting this tooltip popping up. I write that to local web storage and persist it between sessions. So if I actually look at, I don't know why that was set to mobile. I'll turn that off. But if I actually look at the local storage for what's going on here, you can see that well, the grid column state, that's an old property. We've supported that for a while, but this is actually storing the way the columns are set up. So whether or not they're visible, what order they're in, what width the user might have customized, whether or not there's grouping, that's all done by this grid column state, which is an API that we've already had for a while. This expanded groups is what I've done here, and this has the Austria Graz setting. So if I were to say expand or collapse Graz, you can see now that it's changing. Expand Brazil, and expand Campinas, then you can see how it's storing all of this. So it just keeps kind of this nested object to keep track of what's been expanded. And you don't really have to worry too much about the internal structure of that. If you look at what I've done, I use the JSON API and I just serialize it and put it to web storage. Of course, you could do this server side, put it to a database, link it to the user so that no matter what device they come in back on, they get the same exact state that they left it in. And then in the when the form is loading and showing, I do load expanded groups, and I actually use the onReady event of the grid. So if you look at the grid of the grid events, there's this onReady. I restored the column state in the forms on load event, but if I try to do the row group expansion state on load, the found set hasn't yet loaded and the grid hasn't rendered all the stuff, so it's too early and it won't take. So I do it on the onReady event, and then I just call into my load expanded groups and I read that value out of web storage, and I call this set expanded groups. So that's kind of how it's done. It's really, though, this set get API that was added that lets me do that. Something else that we added was the power grid, which is another version of the grid component that's used more for It deals with totally cached data, and it lets you do more powerful analytics like aggregates on grouping and pivot table rendering, et cetera. And we have other webinars just about sort of introducing that component. Just something that changed on this, though, was the support for inline editing. And you can just do that by changing a column property. So if we look at example 2 here, and this loads up a grid here. I don't really have it set up for any of the more powerful analytics, but what I can do is work with a cached data set, do some analytics on it, but if I wanted to, I could also edit a value. So if I wanted to come in and change the quantity, I can do that, which previously I could only do with a specialized edit form. So it would pop up a form that I design, and I'd have to make that form myself. Now we can do inline editing on the columns, and it's pretty easy to set up. If we look at this example 2 form, and I only made quantity editable, it has now this edit type property, which you can set. It used to be that you would set the edit form, and that was it, and that's the form it would show as what you can use to edit. But now we support a text field and a date picker, so you can edit directly inline. Now, keep in mind that this is not a found set like a real data-bound object. It's bound only to a JS data set, which is purely in memory. There's no server-side loading and caching and all that stuff. So what happens when you make an edit is it writes the value back to the underlying data set that you sent to the grid. So there are still events to handle the change. You can see that there's an on column data change you could use to capture the event. But at some point, if you want to do something with that data, either maybe you loaded it from a web service or you generated it from a query or something, you have to figure out how to write it back to your back end. You have to take it from the data set and use that. So it's up to you to figure out where that goes, because it's not directly data bound. Something interesting that was added, this was requested by a user who was familiar with the underlying libraries that this says data grid, but this is actually true of both grids. So it's a bit of a typo on this. Data grid and power grid now support built-in charting because the underlying libraries that we use support charting. So it was a matter of just exposing it. And someone, one of our customers who was aware of that functionality said, hey, why don't you expose the charting functionality so that we can do some visualizations right in the grid. So we did that in this release. Really all you have to do is enable a couple of properties, and you can do some interesting kind of inline charting the end user can do. So again, in this power grid here, what I've done is enabled range selection. So I can select a range of grid cells, and with that, I can enable a context menu. So if I right click, I can go in and do some charting on the ranges and say I'm going to set up a pie chart here, and I'll go ahead and blow this up. And suppose I want to make the data limited to, I don't know, just price and product or something. And then you can see the chart renders here. I can also download this as an image. You can see that here's the image file that I downloaded. So it's not like an embedded analytics or something where the user can share it directly, like you would get with like a report server or something. But if the users want to, the reason this was requested is the users want to do their own kind of ad hoc analytics with the, remembering that this is a pretty powerful, the power grid here is pretty powerful analytics. It can do aggregates and pivot table and that sort of thing. So already the user's doing a fair amount of ad hoc analytics. Why not do some visualization and then save an image, and maybe they want to put that into a document or an email or a report or something. they're free to do that. So that just works inline in the component only. It's not connected to any other sort of modules or anything like that. Okay, that's it for the little demos I have about this component. Again, I can share the example solution here, and we'll post the recording. So why don't we move to take some questions now?
Yeah, thank you, Sean. Looks good. I guess your demos are crystal clear, because no questions so far.
Okay. One thing that I want to mention, there was it wasn't really a demo and it wasn't really an enhancement. It was a small fix or enhancement. Is there are ways to configure globally all your grids, and we had a small change where the individual grid configurations should override the global configurations, and they weren't. So it was like once you set the global configurations, all your grids would work the same, and you couldn't override them, and that's not ideal. So one thing I can show here is that if we look at the on-open event of this solution, I'm using the ng grid service. So that's a separate extension that you can install. And you just do this by right-clicking and download Servoy Package Manager, and you get the extensions that are available. And you can see that I added the latest ng grids component, but there's also the service, which is like an API that goes along with it, and I added that one. And so what I'm doing is saying, hey, all of my data grids here have a header height of 20 and a row height of 40. And so if I were to come in now to my actual form here and set a configuration, say a row height other than what the default is, then say I make it 18 instead of 40. Now you can see I have very tight row spacing there. So that used to not work. It used to be that, hey, if you set it in the service, then it applied and it never got overridden. If you put this back to default, restore default value, then it'll take whatever the service sends. So now you can see it's back to the spaced out view that we set globally. So that's a small change. It wasn't like sure if to call that an enhancement or not, but it's worth knowing that now works.
Cool. In the meantime, there's a question popping up. One very important question. When will the final release be out?
It should be out in about a week or so, like right at the beginning of July, I think. We just have to go through, we made some more fixes and small changes based on feedback from the RC candidates. So we just have to go through some testing, and then that should be out. And there will be an announcement on the forum when that's available.
Yeah. Another question, is it possible to have range selection to copy and paste the selected data to other parts of the same grid or to other grids?
No, I don't believe that's supported. So I think he means if you use the range selection here and drag and select these, could you copy and then insert those into a different range, like down here, like it were an Excel spreadsheet or something? No, that's not supported. That would be, I think, a non-trivial implementation. So if that's something you really want or need, then please file a request at support.servoy.com.
Okay.
I should point out the home for this is the package home is github.com/servoy ag grid components. and the release notes are all here. If you go to the releases with links to the cases and a description. So there you can find out about the releases. You can install it directly just through the package manager, how I showed. So you don't have to go to the GitHub for that. And there's also the wiki there to learn about. If you haven't used these before, there's pretty comprehensive documentation on how to quickly get started there as well. So if this is a bit of a new subject for you, I recommend you go to this location to learn about it.
All right. I don't see any other questions. So I think we can end this webinar.
Okay.
Thank you, Sean.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
We'll be back, and July 15th is the next scheduled tech webinar with some more updates.
Yeah. So I'll write it down, put it in your agenda, and hope to see you all on July 15th. Thanks all for watching, and have a nice day or evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye. Bye.